Hi everyone. So in this video, we'll be learning some more stuff about the demand and supply model. In particular, we're going to be taking a look at demand. So before we saw like on a demand curve, right? Um, that as the price of an item goes up, then the quantity of stuff that people would want to buy would go down, right? The demand for that item will decrease. So here I'm just drawing an example demand curve, right? Not like labeling it with like any specific numbers or anything, just like a generic type of demand curve, right? And here I'm just labeling it D for demand. So that's basically what this negative slope of the demand curve shows, right? The fact that as the price goes up, the quantity that people would want to buy, the quantity demanded, goes down, as we can see here. But of course, we know that there are other things that can affect the amount of an item that people might want to buy, right? So it's not just the price of an item that affects how much of an item that we want to buy. There will be a ton of other things too, right? So that's what this video is going to focus on is, well, what are some of the other things that can affect the demand for an item other than the price of that item itself? Um, and there are potentially like hundreds of different things we could theorize and come up with that can affect demand other than the price of the item itself. But here we're just going to be limiting it to 5 different things to keep it nice and simple. Okay? So there are 5 different things that can, uh, other than the price of the item, that can affect demand. Now, in particular, they can cause an increase in demand for an item, or they can cause a decrease in demand for an item to either make the demand for it go up or the demand for an item to go down. And we'll be talking about each of those in turn and talking about some examples and such. But before we actually get into it, the way that it works is that if something happens that causes an increase in demand, okay, then what happens is that the demand curve will shift right, like this, right? So if this is our demand curve at the start, I'll label that D naught or D0. Then here we can have D1, the new demand curve. This is an increase in demand. Okay, and then just the opposite happens. If there's a decrease in demand, this curve shifts to the left instead, and that causes a decrease in demand. That would be at D2. So if one of these 5 things that I'll be discussing here in this video changes, it will either cause an increase or decrease in demand. And this is how you show it, show that change by shifting the curve either to the left for a decrease or to the right for an increase. Note that if the price of the item itself changes, then we don't need to change the demand curve. We don't need to shift it. We just need to move along the demand curve. We just need to move up or down D0 instead. So we don't need to move it left or right. We just keep along the same demand curve and just move either up or down if the price changes. Okay, if the price of the item itself changes, right? Just like if I scroll up to say this demand curve for bags of chips, if the price of a bag of chips changed from say $3 to $4, right, then we don't need to change the demand curve. We don't need to shift it. We just need to move from this point up to this point right here. Okay, so without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about these 5 different things that can shift the demand curve either to the left or to the right that can cause an increase or decrease to demand. Okay, so first just to list them out, let's talk about those 5 different things that can cause a shift in demand. 5 things that can shift the demand curve. Okay, actually, let's go to back over like this. Okay, number one, a change in income. So, hopefully this seems pretty obvious, right? Like, of course, the amount of an item that you want to buy will, of course, also depend on your income level, not just the price of the item itself. So if you see change to your income, then the amount of an item that you might want to buy can also, of course, change accordingly, right? And there are a couple of different ways that income can actually affect the demand for an item. So we can categorize goods into different items into two different categories: normal goods and inferior goods. So the way that normal goods work are that these are types of goods or products where if your income goes up, then demand for this item also goes up. And of course, vice versa. Right? And hopefully that makes a lot of sense. Of course, we can think of tons of different different examples where if our income levels were to go up, the demand for certain items will go up as well. This is to contrast the idea of inferior goods, which is just the opposite, where if our income goes up, then the demand for the product decreases instead, and vice versa. So you might be wondering, well, what types of items might be considered inferior goods versus, say, normal goods, right? And I think the easiest way to illustrate this example is to have like two similar products and contrast them, compare and contrast two similar types of items. So think, for example, um, like uh, two different bowls of ramen, right? Where one bowl is from like a nice restaurant where, I mean, it's you can't really like sit in to dine anymore, but there's still some restaurants where you can like order carry out, and they still have like really delicious bowls of ramen there that you can order and buy, right? Um, and compare that type of good, that delicious like bowl of restaurant ramen, to say a bowl of instant cup ramen, like those like styrofoam cups where it's just like filled with like dried noodles and like a packet of seasoning, and you're supposed to like pour in the like boiling hot water and then just let it sit for a few minutes, and then it's ready to eat. That instant cup ramen. Well, let's compare those two different types of ramen then, right? Now, of course, the vast majority of us would probably agree, right? The restaurant bowl of ramen is going to be way more delicious compared to, say, the instant cup ramen, right? Naturally, because it's made fresh, and it's not just like dried noodles, right? Um, so that is going to be a much more delicious item, the restaurant bowl of ramen. But of course, restaurant food is going to be way more expensive than just buying the cup of instant cup ramen, right? So these two goods can then be thought of as a contrast in the way that one's normal and the other is inferior, right? So uh, we can think of the restaurant bowl of ramen as a normal good, because it's very delicious, but it's also way more expensive. So it's the type of item where if we got an increase to our income, we can better afford that product, and we would want to probably eat more of it, right? Because we have more income, we want to spend it on you know, something nice for ourselves, like a delicious bowl of ramen. Um, and if our income levels were to go down, then we can't, you know, eat out as often because it's, you know, more expensive, right? So that can be classified as a normal good, that restaurant bowl of ramen. In contrast, an inferior good would be the instant cup ramen. It's not the type of thing that you would probably eat often unless you were on a tight budget, right? If you're on a tight budget, then this might be something that you eat because, you know, it's cheap, and that's like what you can afford, right? You can't afford to eat out often, so the tighter your budget becomes, the more of this item you would buy, the more of the instant cup ramen you would buy, right? So if our income levels were to go down, then our demand for this product would go up. Likewise, if we saw an increase to our income, then the main incentive for purchasing the cheap cup of instant ramen in the first place is diminished, right? The main incentive of buying that cheap ramen is the fact that, well, it's cheap. We don't eat it because, you know, we think it tastes especially delicious or anything like that. We eat it because it's cheap and that's what we can afford. But if we can afford better things, like if our income levels go up, then we won't buy nearly as much as we did before, right? So we can also extend this example outward to like other types of products, like think like designer clothes versus say clothes you can buy at a Goodwill, and you know, so on and so forth, right? The more expensive, higher quality type of product versus like the cheaper, um, like lower quality but more affordable type of item is the easiest way to think about this example. Okay, so let's move on to the next thing that can cause a shift in the demand curve of an item, and that is a change in the price of another related good. So there are two different ways that two different products, two different items, two different goods can be related to each other. So two goods can be substitutes for each other, or they can be complements for each other. So let's start with substitutes. Substitutes are two goods that fulfill a similar purpose to each other. Think, for example, tea and coffee. Okay, so the way that we can think of these two things as substitutes for each other is think about the ways that they are similar, right? Tea and coffee are usually bitter drinks. I mean, unless you sweeten them somehow, but as they come, they're usually pretty bitter. They can be served hot or cold, just kind of like depending on like how you prefer it. Um, and they are caffeinated as well, right? So, both these things are pretty good substitutes for each other. Of course, we might have our own preferences. Maybe you know, someone is more of a tea person, and another person might be more of a coffee person. But you know, they fulfill similar purposes, and they have a lot of similarities that kind of like overlap with each other, even if we might prefer one compared to the other. So we can think of these two things as substitutes. So how is it that a change in the price of one thing, say tea, will affect the demand for coffee, the other thing, right? So let's actually take a look at how that works by drawing a graph here, just to make sure it's really clear what I'm talking about. So consider here demand for, tea and demand for coffee. Okay, so I'll just draw little graph here, quantity demanded down here, the price of tea over here. This is the demand for tea, right? Now, actually, let's do it like this instead. I want to put tea up here. Okay. So, this is the demand for tea. Now, let's suppose that the price of tea were to decrease, right? So let's say start off up here at price level 0, and let's say it went down to here at price level 1, P1. Well, clearly, we can see, according to the law of demand, right? Price goes down, quantity demanded for tea goes up, right? So, people will buy more tea when the price of tea goes down, right? That's something that should be very familiar to us right now, considering the law of demand. Now, let's consider how this might affect the demand for coffee, though. So, this is the demand for coffee. Now, since people are buying more tea, and since tea is a good substitute for coffee, right? Since since they're pretty similar and they fulfill like similar types of purposes. If you want like a caffeinated drink, either one can be pretty good for you. To help satiate your desire for a caffeinated beverage. Then, in that case, since people are buying more tea, people don't really need to buy as much coffee anymore, right? So the demand for coffee will see a decrease, just like this, right? So that is essentially how substitutes work. If the price of one thing changes, it will affect the demand for the other, in the sense that, well, the price of tea went down, so does the demand for coffee. And of course, it also works vice versa. So if the price went up, like say we start at price level 1, P1, and then the price for tea went up to P0, then it's just the opposite for coffee. Coffee will see an increase to demand, so we would shift it to the right instead, right? And hopefully that makes sense. People see tea got more expensive, so they substitute by buying more coffee instead. Okay, so now let's think about complements. So, two goods are complements. Well, if they go well together. And what I mean by go well together is basically just any two goods that people happen to like to use in conjunction with one another. So, easy example here would be, say, breakfast cereal and milk, right? If you want to have a bowl of cereal, then you probably also want to have it with milk, right? You usually don't have breakfast cereal just like by itself, right? So we can think of these two things as being complements for each other because they are things that people usually like to use together, right? So the way that works out here, I'll have to draw another separate two graphs. So let's take a look at the demand for cereal and the demand for milk. So there's the demand for cereal, and then over here I will draw the demand for milk. So let's once again consider how a decrease in the price of cereal might affect the demand for milk. So let's say we start off at this price up here, P0 for cereal, and price sees a decrease for cereal. Then again, as usual, law of demand says that people will probably want to buy more cereal, right? And that's exactly what we see here. Quantity demanded goes from QD0 to QD1, right? So people are buying more cereal. So if people are buying more cereal, then of course people will also want to buy more milk, right? Because people need more milk to go along with their cereal. So the demand for milk sees an increase, right? From D0 to D1. And hopefully that makes a lot of sense. The opposite is also true, by the way. If the price of cereal saw an increase, let's say we saw at P1 and went up to P0, then people buy less cereal, law of demand, right? Then, of course, people don't need as much milk because they have less cereal. Of course, you might still buy milk for like other purposes. You might still buy milk just for drinking, for example. But the point is that since people are buying less cereal, they will still need uh, some amount less of milk as well. So demand for milk will decrease instead. So hopefully that makes a lot of sense. So that's how two goods can be related, right? They can be substitutes or complements for each other. And how a price change in one thing can affect the demand for the other thing. Okay, just three more left to go, and thankfully, the remaining three are actually much quicker and easier to explain compared to the first two. There's less complexity compared to the first two. So these should go by a little bit quicker. So, number three is changes in tastes and preferences. So we all have our own personal tastes and preferences for like things that we enjoy, right? And of course, these things can change over time for any number of reasons. And it just works exactly the way you like. If we start preferring one type of product, then the demand for that item goes up. If we start preferring a different type of item, then the demand for the item might go down instead, right? So let's consider, for example, ice cream as a dessert during winter and summer. Whoops, there we go. So as you would probably expect, right, ice cream being a cold treat, a cold like dessert that you can get, it's probably not something that a lot of people want during winter because it's cold, and the last thing you want is a cold treat because that would just make you even colder, right? So the demand for ice cream would go down during winter, and that's something we see, of course, in the data as well. Ice cream sales do go down during winter. And in contrast, ice cream sales go up during summer. The demand for ice cream goes up during summer. And of course, hopefully that makes a lot of sense because, if it's summer, it's hot, you want something to help cool you down. And ice cream and other cold treats, cold desserts, can be a good way to do that. So that's something that just happens naturally over the course of the year, or we have like different tastes and preferences depending on what time of year it happens to be, right? Same thing with like different types of clothes. Of course, we want to dress lighter during summer and wear like more layers during winter, so on and so forth, right? Um, it's not just that though. We can also take a look at like trends. So for example, like disco music or like punk bands or like garage bands, those types of music all had like their heyday in the past. And although those types of music still exist today, they're no longer like as popular as they used to be because they're just not like in the current like trend or anything like that, right? Whereas, say, K-pop became more popular just starting with several years ago, right? So it can also change over time, over the course of many years, just according to like what happens to be popular, what's trending, so on and so forth, right? So yeah, this is pretty kind of like vague and open-ended, but hopefully it makes sense, right? Changes in people's tastes and preferences, what they like, what they might not like, of course, can change over time, and demand will reflect that. Okay, then number four is changes in the number of buyers. Now, hopefully that makes a lot of sense. It works exactly the same way that we would expect. If there are more buyers entering the market, then demand for an item goes up. If there are fewer buyers, then it goes down, right? Hopefully that makes a lot of sense. So for example, let's say if more people move to a city, more people move to a city, then the demand for housing in that area goes up, right? If people move out, then just the opposite, right? So if more people coming in, there are more people in general, more buyers, more people who need housing, therefore demand for housing goes up. And just the opposite if people decide to move away from a city. Um, Another example could be think about like the baby boomer population. As more of them get older and older, what do you think will happen to the demand for, say, nursing home services, right? So hopefully it all works out in a fairly intuitive way, right? More buyers, more demand, less buyers, of course, less demand. Okay, last but not least is changes in expectations about future prices, or even more in general, changes in expectations about the future. So let's consider, for example, what should happen to the current demand for certain products in anticipation of a sale. So think about, for example, the demand for electronic goods, let's say 2 weeks before Cyber Monday, right? So we have Black Friday after Thanksgiving and then Cyber Monday afterward. Well, of course, we know that you know those that is a period of time in which people expect to see sales on various different types of electronic goods. And so 2 weeks before, Black Friday and Cyber Monday actually happens, then the demand for those types of goods decreases at that point in time, right? 2 weeks before the sales actually happen. But then, of course, when the sales actually do happen, when it's Black Friday, when it's Cyber Monday, the prices decrease because of the sale, and then people start buying more of that item, right? So hopefully that makes a lot of sense. If you're expecting something to go on sale in the future, in the near future, then of course our demand would go down for that item right now, right? Um, it's not just about like sales and stuff though. Let's say for example, we are expecting there's a pandemic, so let's say we're expecting maybe we might get laid off, maybe we could lose a job. That's something that unfortunately a lot of you might have experienced potentially, or at least friends, family members, something like that. I know I have certainly experienced it personally myself. It's unfortunate, but that's kind of the state of the world that we're in, unfortunately. Um, and if we expect to get laid off, or if we have been laid off, then of course, like if we're expecting to get laid off, we're going to see a sharp decrease to our income. So we want to start saving more of our money now, right? So our demand for different types of things will decrease right now, even though we might not have been, laid off yet. If we're expecting that that's a possibility, then just in case we want to stop spending so much money and start saving more money right now, right? So demand for items will go down, uh, uh, just because we expect potentially we might get laid off in the future. And the opposite is also true. If we're expecting like a raise, for example, if we're expecting to get a raise, then we might feel a little bit better about spending more money right now. So hopefully that makes a lot of sense. Those are the 5 different things that can cause a shift in demand. And remember, it always works out the same way. when there's an increase in demand, it shifts it to the right. When it's a decrease to demand, you shift it to the left. Okay, so that's it for this video. In the next video, we will be talking about things that can affect supply. So I will see you then.